All right. So, hello. Again, my name is Gab Pacanio. I'm one of the core adjudication panels or CAPs of Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championship happening in June 13 or in Friday. So, today we are going to talk about the Philippine left. And let's first start with a few disclaimers. So, there are three. So, the first one is I'm not an expert. I'm not a political science or history graduate. I'm merely just a passionate person about this specific topic, given my experience and my observations within the political left spectrum. The second one is that this lecture does not aim to provide a comprehensive overview of the Philippine left. So there might be aspects or dimensions of the Philippine left that I'm not able to discuss, given the time constraints or the fact that the Philippine left is um, rich in history, and it's very important to also acknowledge that it's almost impossible to cover every single aspect of the Philippine left. So you were left with me discussing the basics and mostly the things that are going to be foundational, especially in debate rounds, things that you don't want to miss, or things that you want to have context on to ensure that your debate round is um as good as it can be. And the third one is you're encouraged to critically engage and disagree with the content, as this lecture reflects my own political views and perspectives. And again, this is shaped by my own observations, shaped by my own research, and often my own political views will bleed into this lecture. So you might want to take a step back and assess this specific lecture objectively and somehow compare this with your own observation, or ensure that you are guided when you listen to this. Okay. So here are the key tenets of the Philippine left spectrum. When we say key tenets, these are the usual universal grounds of what it counts to be or what it means to be part of the Philippine left. So the first one is social justice, of course. While there are different visions of change or means of change done by these organizations, they mostly propose social justice. They believe in equality, freedom from any form of oppression. So mostly, or most of the left-oriented or leftist-oriented groups fight for the cause of women, fight for the cause of farmers, labor unions, fight for the cause of of the queer community, minorities, cultural minorities, indigenous groups, etc., etc. And they also believe in fiscal accountability. They believe in a world where communities, or they believe in a world where it's free from corruption. So social justice, there is accountability. They believe in equality and freedom from any form of oppression. Any deviation from social justice is, I think, uh, important because these are the nuances of different political groups in the left. But I think the most common umbrella is they all believe in social justice. It's just that there are different interpretations of what it means and how to advance it in the first place. The second one is multi-sectoral. So multi-sectoral, it includes different sectors into its fight. As you have said before, like women, the LGBT community, the children and the youth, even religious organizations, indigenous groups, Moros in Mindanao, cultural minorities, and etc., etc. So it's very important to acknowledge that the left spectrum often um, includes or often prioritizes the campaign or the campaigns of these sectors. And the last one is they also prioritize grassroots organizing to develop their own base. So grassroots organizing is divided into three parts. The first one is is mass working or mass work. So mass work is a general term for the ways in which the Philippine left consolidates or galvanizes support in the Philippines or in communities. So they often go to communities, they often conduct educational discussions, consciousness raising activities, to ensure that individuals are aware, or at least they understand their rights and the ways in which oppression works or occurs. So, for example, they are conscientizing women to understand patriarchy, or they are helping children and the youth to understand what abuses are, or what oppression or how violence structurally disadvantages them. So most of the time, these groups go into communities to ensure that they build their mass base there. So often they thrive in communities, and they ensure that these individuals or groups or communities are aware of what their basic rights are. The second one is campaign formation. So after developing consciousness, after developing the knowledge and information of oppression, what to do about it, what are the steps that the movement should take to advance their rights, groups then negotiate and consolidate information and different tactics for them to form their own campaign. So these are necessary for them to be able to advance their rights. So some groups in the Philippine left spectrum operate in legislative bodies, like for example, party lists, even in the Senate. They draft and craft policies, and they also prioritize um, impacts or how it influences the country. Other groups prioritize community development efforts and initiatives. So they build organizations inside communities. They form coalitions. They form alliances within groups or within communities to ensure that um, they advance the same campaign. They lobby. They rally on the streets, and they make people aware of what their rights are. And the third one is alliance work. So alliance work is consolidating support from different nuances or different groups in the Philippine left. So mostly these are formed through coalition building, through negotiations, through cooperations and partnerships to at least strengthen your ability to make your message as pervasive and as persuasive as it is. And mostly, again, the strength of the left comes with its numbers. The people who believe in the cause of their advocacies. So it's very important for them to galvanize and consolidate support, and it's also very important for them to get people to support them. So again, the left spectrum, these are the key tenets of what it means for you to, or for what it means for them to be part of the organization or the spectrum. Okay. So here are the broad categories. There are air quotes because, again, not as comprehensive. So I'm only going to talk about the most popular forms of, or the most popular categories of the Philippine left in the Philippines in our own context. So national democracy, social democracy, and liberal democracy. So next slide. What are the common misconceptions in debating whenever we hear the left or whenever we hear the Philippine left spectrum? So I think most of the time we hear that most debaters or some debaters in the Philippines equate liberals as progressives. In some contexts, that might be the case, but in the Philippines, there are different nuances to being a progressive. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a liberal automatically equates you to be a progressive or automatically means that you are a progressive individual. So there has to be a certain threshold that needs to be reached in order for you to be considered a progressive. And again, not all liberals are progressive, although some liberals are progressive. So equating liberals and the progressive sector or community is a fallacy because again, that's just a part of what it means or what it counts for you to be part of the progressive structure or progressive community. So again, it's not um, a general view or it's not a general term for everyone who is progressive. Um, the second one is that leftists are violent groups of individual who are going to terrorize communities. Although this is not a misconception I often hear in debate, these are misconceptions that we hear often outside of debate. So, in communities, in even propagated by the administration, that leftist groups are terrorists, that they are going to ransack communities, that they're going to kill people, and they only value aggression as it is. Again, the Philippine left is a spectrum, and it's also very important to understand the root causes for that violence. So later on, we'll tackle several groups that underpin that kind of ideology, and I think it's also very important to tackle this in a nuanced manner. All right. So early leftist movements. So what are the early origins of early leftist movements in the Philippines? So as you can read, socialist ideas emerged during anti-colonial struggles and labor peasant movements. So like for example, PKP or Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas or CPP was formally founded on 1930. They also allied with the peasant-led Socialist Party and organized hukbalahap during World War II against the Japanese soldiers when they against the Japanese soldiers. So Hukbalahap or Hukbo Bayan or Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa Hapon is composed of peasant leaders in Central Luzon. Um, so originally, most of the peasant leaders realized that the Japanese occupation is going to um, cause for them to lose, or it's going to influence them in a way that they will lose their land, or they will lose their ownership of their land or their properties, which then radicalized them and encouraged them to mobilize several peasant leaders in their area, most specifically in Central Luzon, so Pampanga, Nueva Ecija, Olongapo, etc. And they formed um, guerrilla groups. So later on, during the worsening political and economic climate during the Japanese occupation, they became an underground political group, and they also engaged in guerrilla warfare. So they formed tactical units across Central Luzon, and they engaged against the Japanese oppression or Japanese occupation against Japanese soldiers during that time. So it's very important to also understand how uh, the anti-colonial or anti-imperialist struggles of the communist group has somehow helped the Philippines to be liberated from these oppressive and imperialist structures during their time. So, as contrary to what the government is painting or the government wants them to be painted. Okay, so a little bit of history. After the Japanese occupation, um, the government also tagged them as terrorists, primarily because they continued their tactical warfare against the government after the Japanese occupation, given the lack of genuine agrarian reform, or given the fact that the government or the state does not prioritize their land, or does not prioritize the provision of genuine agrarian reform, or them being freed from the existence of landowners, pesky middlemen, etc., etc. So the hacienda owners still persisted during their time, which led to the gradual um, influence or the gradual growth of Hukbalahap, which then also extended their tag as a terrorist group from the government as they were perceived to be. So, okay. So the revolutionary left. So in December 1968, Joma Sison refounded the CPP on a Maoist National Democratic Program. So in March 1969, Sison's CPP allied with a small peasant militia led by Bernabe Vizcaino, forming the New People's Army or NPA as its armed wing. So CPP NPA became a formalized union during 1969. And the United Front was organized in 1973 to coordinate underground and legal groups. So again, these are organized groups. So they're not crazy, irrational terrorists as the government frames them to be, right? Because they have their own administration, they have their own organization, they know how to organize, and they know how to extend their influence. So CPP, NPA, NDF was formalized in 1973 to organize its insurgency program against the state, primarily because the state is viewed as the number one oppressor of the society. So one of the primary advancements, or one of the primary um, rationales for why CPP, NPA, and DF was strengthened was because it has to subvert the state. It has to replace the state, and it has to overthrow the existing capitalist system that there is. And obviously, it's perceived as a terrorist group by the Philippine, or by the present Philippine administration during Duterte's time. But then again, it is politically perceived as a terrorist organization. So it solely depends on whether or not you view insurgency or whether or not you view armed conflict as a valid form of defense or as a valid form of advancing certain advocacies or certain held beliefs by these by the CPP, NPA, and NDF. So very important to also acknowledge that the term terrorist is politically perceived and politically constructed by those in power who deems this to be an obstruction towards their goals or towards their self-vested interest, right? So I think it's very important to be critical as well. So the Great Rectification. So after Marcos fell in 1986, the CPP faced internal debate over strategy. So this culminated in the Second Great Rectification, splits around 1992. So this is where the reaffirmist faction and the rejectionist faction came into light. So the reaffirmist faction is generally believes that the group should stay in the MLM line, so Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist faction or line. So they have to ensure that they stay true to their ideological and stay true to their principles and values that the organization or the movement holds. So while on the other hand, the rejectionists reject the sweeping conclusions of the uh, statement or the document, which is entitled Reaffirm Our Basic Principles and Rectify Our Errors, as something that dismisses their general or genuine complaints as framed by the rejectionists. So the reaffirmists upheld the document and the MLM line, while the rejectionists rejected the conclusions of that document. So let's first talk about the reaffirmists, right? So RA or reaffirmists upholds the Marxism, Leninism, and Mao thought. They generally believe that the Philippine society is semi-feudal and semi-colonial. So semi-feudal means that even if the Philippines positions itself as a capitalist society, they generally see uh, the country still as a feudal country or a semi-feudal country. Why? Because there is still an existence of landlords, middlemen is still persisting in the countryside, and the farmers and the peasants are still oppressed, meaning it's not as uh, it's not as independent as it should be, and it's reliant on uh, it's reliant on the power or it's reliant on the authority displayed by the landlords and the middlemen. So generally, they control production and they control the agrarian lands or plots or hectares in the countryside. And semi-colonial, because even though we're technically freed from imperialist countries or from colonizers, we are still victims of imperialism through foreign intervention, through several initiatives focused on controlling our own economy and political decisions as led by different authorities from the West. So it's very important to also acknowledge that the power that the United States hold and the power that China holds over the Philippines is somewhat tremendous and massive, given that they are hegemons. So our economy, most of our policies are not geared for our own people, but they are geared towards the adjustment towards the hegemons that outmaneuvers our own economic and political decisions, as believed by RAs or reaffirmists, right? They are also advocating for protracted people's war in the countryside. So they believe that armed conflict is um, a valid form of self-defense against the state's abuse, against the state violence that minorities and the marginalized are experiencing. And again, even if they do advocate for armed conflict, I want to note that this is still a spectrum. So some RAs absolutely believe that democratic processes, like for example elections, or like for example um, the transition of power isn't going to solve anything, primarily because it still maintains the hegemonic power of structure and capitalism. So, what they believe is communism is the only way for us to be able to change the current trajectory of our country and to free and liberate our people from oppression or oppressive structures. So, some RAs generally believe that it's still important for us to maximize all means, which is why some RAs, even though they believe that armed conflict is valid, they still participate in democratic processes. They still elect party lists who align with their goals, and they still participate in lobbying efforts and initiatives to at least ensure that our country is provided with proper checks and balances. So again, even if you believe in armed conflict, it's not as if it's the only solution, or it's not the only way that RAs believe in when they fight or when they advance these political and social and economic rights. All right. And it maintains that the CPP is the vanguard of the proletariat because one of the primary observations of rejectionists is that the CPP is no longer trusted by the masses anymore, given that they have succumbed to dogmatic and authoritarian means of control. Um, and I think one thing is for sure, right? So one of the ways in which the CPP, NPA, NDF maintains control and authority within the movement is that they do not allow for questioning and they do not allow for um, any schisms within the movement. So the first rationale or the first reasoning behind this is because they want to maintain unity and they want to maintain a broad front of strength. Any deviation away from MLM or Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism is viewed as a deviation away from the party's principles. So it's very important to also acknowledge that it is a bit hardened and it is a bit absolutist when it comes to their own principles. So one of the main criticisms towards the reaffirmists is that they are a bit dogmatic and they do not adjust to the current context, or they do not adjust to the current trajectory of the political situation or the political dynamics in our country right now, or in the Philippines before when the split happened. Which is why um the rejectionists came into light. So the rejectionists are okay. So the rejectionists initially challenged the legitimacy of the CPP leadership. Again, they viewed it as dogmatic, they viewed it as controlling, and they viewed the mass base as somewhat not an extension of the masses' interests anymore. So they highlighted the importance of open debates, the importance of democratic reforms, and varied revolutionary strategies. So one of the primary reasons why the CPP, NPA, and the F a bit radicalized during their time was because of the Marcos regime and dictatorship. So I think it's already known that one of the biggest recruiters of the movement was the Marcos regime, because a lot of people were radicalized. A lot of students joined in the countryside because of repression, because of abuse, because of state-sponsored violence. So it is important to also acknowledge that this context was a bit that the context of the reaffirmists and the context in which they revolve in is a bit aggressive, if you might say, or it's a bit radical on their opinion. So after the rule or after the Marcos regime, most of the rejectionists think that we should open our own movement towards different forms of change or different means of change. So some of them highlighted the importance of reform. Some of them highlighted the importance of different revolutionary strategies that the movement can partake in. So over time, even the rejectionists were fragmented given the diverse accounts of different political perspectives. So for example, differences when it comes to how do we advance socialism, or differences when it comes to how do we advance our own tactics and ideologies. So it's very important to still acknowledge that even though they are fragmented, they are still progressive to some extent because they still believe in the tenets of social justice, and they still believe they still believe in the fight against oppression. So it's just the fact that there are ideological, tactical, and personal differences that came into light given our own and their varied political differences. So that is very important to take note of. So going back to the reaffirmist stance, um, there are certain motions like this one. So, as we read, this House believes that leftist groups in the Philippines should actively refrain from publicly criticizing current and former political opposition figures in the country. So, I think this motion was from PIDC 2024, although this is also a classic motion because time and time again, we see motions about active criticisms, infighting, broad unity or broad coalitions from the left or the opposition movement. And I think it's also important to acknowledge how um, it's very important to talk about it, given that um, our rights and the existence of the Philippine left is being threatened by the current administration of Marcos today. So, what are the criticisms or what are the examples of criticisms? So, for this one, we can use Pinoy as, may he rest in peace, as one of the examples of the criticisms of the left towards leftist or left-leaning politicians, like Pinoy, who is a liberal or who is a center-left politician in the Philippines. So, what are some of the criticisms raised against his term? So the first one is that he is pro-imperialist and pro-US when it comes to his foreign policies. So the EDCA or uh the propping up of US bases, the extension of their stay in Olongapo in Zubik was criticized given that the reaffirmists or most of the progressives believe that their existence in our land can cause imperialist shifts or can forcefully allow or to forcefully subdue our own interests because again the Philippines is going to uh, succumb to the interests of US given that there is a political play behind it. The second one is neoliberal economic policies. So during his time, our economy also liberalized, meaning we opened most of our borders towards countries, removing certain tariffs. So we avoided protectionist policies. So we became import we became import oriented and export oriented, and it also became a lot higher, or most of the attacks against the poor austerity measures um, became critical during Pinoy's time. Although, again, that's a bit debatable because some view neoliberal policies to be good, some view that neoliberal policies to be a bit negative. And the failure of genuine land reform, given his political and family ties with the Hacienda family who operate the Hacienda Luisita family who operates the Hacienda Luisita in Central Luzon. So very important. And CARPER as well. So CARPER is the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Act um, that attempts to give back the lands or that attempts to help the farmers to have or to legitimize their own lands in their own um, on their own. So apparently, it's a bit hard for them to be able to do that now, given how some landlords and some middlemen were able to cheat the system out. So this is perceived as a failure, mostly perceived by the NatDems or the National Democrats that we'll discuss later. But these are valid criticisms from the left towards existing left-leaning politicians and figures in the country. All right. So let's now talk about national democracy. And democracy or NDs are part of the reaffirmist sector. So NatDems or National Democrats believe that there are three ills that causes poverty or that wreaks havoc in the Philippines. The first one is imperialism. So it is the dominant control, subjugation, caused by foreign countries towards the Philippines through different mediums. For example, foreign policies, economic subjugation, even pop culture manifested through the popularization of English and the deletion or erasure of cultural languages that we have in the Philippines, how it impacts education, how most of the interests that most Filipinos hold now are often foreign oriented or foreign leaning. The second one is feudalism. So the reason why most of the minorities in the countryside are oppressed, the reason why most of our industries are not as improved, because we generally believe in landlords, and this often cascades into oppression. Because again, landlords uh, do not treat their workers fairly. Farmers are often oppressed. The surplus value of their agricultural produce, etc., etc. And bureaucrat capitalism. So bureaucrat capitalism is the consolidation of resources in the political aspect or any political aspect. So the government, in collaboration or corroboration with corporations, often protect their interests. So politicians protect the interest of corporations, and corporations protect the interests of politicians through mutual support, which ends up in neoliberal policies that often impacts the marginalized. So these are the three ills of the society as perceived by the National Democratic Movement, and they aim to and most of their activities or campaigns are formed to combat against the three ills of the community or the society as a whole. So not thems. So these are the organizations or legal organizations that are not them leaning, meaning they espouse the national democratic line. So the Makabayan bloc composed of several party lists like Bayan Muna, ACT Teachers, Gabrielle Women's Party, Anak Pawis, and even Kabataan Party list. So you can see legal because some not them organizations are underground. So some of them uh, again, CPP, NPA, NDF is also not them, and they believed in the cause of armed conflict. While the legal organizations, they do not inherently promote armed conflict, but they believe in the validity of armed conflict. And often, this is the reason why they're often red tagged by the state because they do not and they're aligned with the not them movement and ideology, but they're not necessarily terrorists because the primary aspect or the primary way of the legal organizations to advance change is to pass policies, especially the Makabayan Bloc. It is to lobby and create policies in support of the Filipino people. So as you can see, again, even the National Democratic Movement is a spectrum. And it's also important to recognize that even if um, even if they advance it through means of armed conflict, there are root causes that force certain minorities and the marginalized to pursue that kind of change or to pursue that kind of means of change. Okay. And again, these are also examples of sectoral organizations in the youth sector. So Anak Bayan, League of Filipino Students. So Anak Bayan is a comprehensive mass organization that aims to fight for different rights. League of Filipino Students, also comprehensive, but focuses on anti-imperialist advocacies and campaigns. SEM Philippines, Student Christian Movement of the Philippines, is a not them leaning or not them oriented youth group that focuses on or that consolidates support from the Christians in the Philippines, and they use liberation theology as um, tenet or their primary means of change. Panday Sining consolidates support through artistic expression. So they are the cultural wing of Anak Bayan. So very important to acknowledge. Okay. All right. We've already tackled rejectionists. So here's one of the primary categories of or primary splits from the rejectionist party or rejectionist faction. It is the social democrats or the social democracy inclined to believe um, that we can still include the principles of socialism through democratic processes. So we can elect socialist leaders, we can elect socialist leaders who will propose socialist policies at the end of the day. They believe in systemic change, but without authoritarianism or violent revolution. So they often criticize the Not Them movement, saying that the Not Them movement is a bit violent and um, they should denounce the CPP, NPA, and the F because they often um, cause casualties, which is not something that they believe in because they believe in peace processes that often cascades into change. We can change the world peacefully. We can elect our leaders peacefully, etc., etc. So one of the criticisms um, of socialist democracy is that it's a bit hard for reforms to generally sweep the community or the Philippines as a whole. primarily because the three ills, as noted by the NatDems, is still present. So feudalism, imperialism, and bureaucrat capitalism won't be changed by simple reforms because these are institutions that are still going to be present even if you quote unquote reform the society. So these are valid criticisms, and I do think that socialist or social democracy is still valid given that um it is valid for people to feel averse about against violence or against revolution. But I think it's something that you have to decide on as you listen to this lecture, because again, it is something that people believe in um generally. So okay. An example is Akbayan Party List, who recently won 3 seats in House of Representatives, led by Chal Jokno and the other two individuals on the seat. All right. NGOism or NGOism. So since the 1970s, many NGOs and civil society groups formed or expanded, often with leftist organizers. So this quote-unquote civil society sector became a space for left-oriented advocacy on health, environment, human rights, etc. So NGOs are legal organizations accredited by the government. So often, most of those who left the quote-unquote radical spectrum of the movement and joined themselves with NGOs. They formed NGO groups and they formed the civil society. So often NGOs fill in the gap of the government. So they provide certain services that the government does not, or they provide technical support to the government to improve its services. So they often collaborate with these groups to ensure that they are helping the marginalized advance their rights. And often NGOs form broad coalitions or alliances to ensure that they form campaigns to strengthen the fight against oppression or oppressive structures. So currently I am employed. I am an NGO worker. So I work for Philippine Against Child Trafficking, which is an organization against human trafficking, against child trafficking and abuse against children and the youth. So NGOism is a criticism against NGOs, or it is a perception that NGOs or civil society groups have been co-opted by quote unquote capitalist structures. So I'm using air quotes because often these are political observations made by individuals, and I'm saying them because they're valid. And it's also important to take note of them. So here's a motion about NGOism. So this house regrets the NGOism or NGOism of social movements. So okay. So what are the criticisms against NGOism or NGOs within social movements? So I think the first one is the acknowledgement that NGOs have often co-opted grassroots movements. So it is important to also acknowledge that the primary advancement or the means of change of NGOs is through sweeping reforms. So it does not support violent means of change. It does not support radical means of change. So often some uh, some progressives from the Philippine left criticize NGOs because they pacify the anger of groups by filling in the buffer zone. So people are not going to rally anymore. People are not going to subvert the government anymore because NGOs fill in that gap without realizing that there is still a gap that is left by the government, and the three structures of oppressive and the oppressive structures are still present. The second one is that they are foreign funded, meaning most of the resource capital or the resource capital itself of NGOs come from foreign investors and foreign funders. And again, it's very important to realize, or it's very important to remember, that imperialist structures often extend itself through development aid. So, for example, US aid, Aus aid, or other European funders often fund NGOs in the Philippines for them to be able to expand or for them to be able to extend their cultural influence in developing societies or in the global south. So they often do this in countries who are part of the developing sector. So yeah. The third one is that um, they operate and they often work within the system, which is I think valid because I think it's easier for groups to um, operate, and it's easier for them to remain safe given our political climate. But then again, it is a valid criticism because it aims or it often forces people to be pacified on that regard. And I think the arguments for NGOs is a bit easy. So, for example, it is important for NGOs to exist because we can't live in a world where armed conflict is the only solution. But secondly, it's also important to acknowledge that the government will always have its flaws. So, absent that, it's going to be a lot harder for the marginalized to survive. So, it's important for the NGOs to step in and provide those services. Um, so I think again, it depends on what perspective and it depends on what lens you're going to view NGOs in. And it's also important to reconcile these doubts and to not sideline them because they're valid criticisms at the end of the day. All right. Liberal Party. So I think you're already familiar with the Liberal Party. So often they capitalize on respectability politics, meaning they do not engage in radical forms of change or radical means of change. And the way they view social progress is through development that is centered towards market stability. Which is why centrists and center left politicians often prioritize or often still attach themselves to neoliberal policies because through liberalizing your economy, you are opening yourself to cosmopolitan values and influence from the foreign and global arena. So it's very important to also recognize how this might impact and influence grassroots organizing and movements on the ground. So the notable figures are Manuel Rojas, Ninoy Aquino, Jr., Corazon Aquino, Benigno Aquino, and Lenny Robredo. All right. So, all right, I'm sure that you're already very familiar with infighting debates. Most often than not, we talk about them in side movements, and of course, the left is not excused or exempted from that. So, infighting within the left. So, again, the left is not an umbrella organization. It's just a term coined to collectively call groups that align with the left or that are left leaning. So ideological differences are often are often the cause or is the number one cause of infighting. So for example, again, ND groups accuse reformists or NGO-based leftists as they sell out because they succumb to capitalist structures to prioritize or to change the society, which I think is, as they argue, not as ideal. The second is SOCDEMs or Socialist Democrats criticize NDs for being too authoritarian, too radical or dogmatic. And I think that's also a valid criticism in which we should fix or attempt to change within the movement, especially if we want to improve. The second is electoral strategy. So these are disputes over whether to participate in elections. Like, for example, Akbayan in coalition with the Liberal Party, or the skepticism of the Not Dem movement of electoral politics, because they are still maneuvered by the capitalist structure, they still operate within the interest of politicians, political dynasties, and they are still influenced by the global superpowers like US and China. So it's very important to also acknowledge that these are, again, valid criticisms. Third, peace process. So some factions support peace talks with the state. Others call it a tactic for pacification or betrayal of armed struggle. And I think it's important to note that um, the CPP, NPA, NDF has often participated in peace talks until it was shut down by uh, Duterte and until it was shut down by most of the presidents of the Philippines, actually, which is why they are still radicalized and the root causes of armed conflict is still not yet solved. So it's very important to recognize that these are systemic injustices that is going to continue to perpetuate in cycle if you don't if the government or the state does not solve the root causes of the problem or the root cause of the problem or the root cause of poverty, oppression, injustice, inequality, right? Fourth, engagement with foreign aid. So again, NGOs or groups are tied to foreign donors, which can lead to the co-optation of more radical groups, or often they are characterized through top-down approaches. So often, the foreign donors design the packages that will be implemented by the NGOs, which is why it's not as consultative or it's not as flexible to the interests of the grassroots communities. So it's very important to also acknowledge that again, these are one of the imperialist influences that um, impact or affect our marginalized communities. Um, the second bullet under this is that divisions on whether funding compromises independence or is a necessary tactic. So there are questions of whether or not we should accept funding from these groups because we have to strengthen our base, or is it more of a way for them to control our movement and therefore dilute our advocacies? And I think again, um, this is also somewhat a category or a common clash in debates on whether or not we should support or trust foreign intervention from groups who support developing sectors or developing marginalized sectors. So I think it's very important to think about, um, especially when we encounter these kinds of motions. All right, so let's now move to the state suppressive or the state suppression initiatives um, done by two presidents, so Pinoy and Duterte. So Oplan Bayanihan is the counterinsurgency program of the armed forces of the Philippines. So again, the strength or often counterinsurgency programs are supported by the United States of America, and the historical context of this was during McCarthy's time or McCarthyism, when the waves of Red Scare became more popular or became prominent. So they're against left-leaning individuals because they view them as uh, entities that will destabilize the government. So Pinoy officially launched the Oplan Bayanihan, which is to strengthen the AFP and the PNP to target and to catch insurgencies or insurgents in the countryside. So they strengthen their combating power in their military operations, and they combine this with developing development efforts. So often, uh, military groups will go into the countryside, they will provide relief to communities, and they will also use it as a way or a tool to profile certain community members for them to be able to check whether or not this individual is a member of the CPP NPA. And often, these are allegations, which are often unfounded. So they catch people, they tag them as political insurgents, which then led to the rise of political prisoners in the Philippines. Oh, which I think is still a tactic used by Duterte during his time and is still being continued by Marcos during his time. So very sad and unfortunate. Whole of nation approach, or WONA, is a governance framework that brings together all sectors of government and society to address internal conflicts, especially the communist insurgency led by the CPP, NPA, NDF. So whole of nation approach is uh, an approach that aims to consolidate several departments in the Philippines to target or to at least end internal conflicts and insurgency within the Philippines. So even the Department of Education, even other groups are used to suppress the ongoing underground movements and are often used to red tag progressive groups even if they're legal. So it was formally institutionalized under President Duterte through Executive Order number 70, which then led to the creation of NTF-ELCA, which is the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, which is an interagency coordination between several departments in the Philippines to suppress and stop the current issues of insurgency. But then again, the true issue here is not insurgency. It is the reason behind insurgency, which is an important topic in and of itself. Which is why I personally believe that tagging um, these insurgents as terrorists also uses the same language that the government uses against these groups who have a valid claim or have a valid concern against them. So it is important to also acknowledge that tagging a group as a terrorist is politically charged. So you have to be careful, and you want to make sure that you are not espousing the same language that the state uses to terror tag its own people. So yeah, all right. And I think that concludes today's discussion about the Philippine left. Again, it's not as comprehensive because there are several aspects, but hopefully we covered the basics of the Philippine left. Um, the three broad categories, the organizations, and the nuances between different organizations. Thank you and good luck.